Good morning. Welcome to my basement. I am Pastor Bill Hennessy, the pastor at North Presbyterian Church in Williamsville, New York. And this is a Bible study that I'm providing during this period of separation that we're observing because of the pandemic. I use the daily lectionary readings as they can be found on the Presbyterian Church website at pcusa.org. If you go there and do a search for the daily lectionary readings, you'll go right to the place where I find those. So today I want to look at two of the readings. One is the epistle and the other the gospel. So we'll just go right to those. The first then is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And, like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." To you then who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Okay, so that's a passage somewhat familiar, perhaps, to some of you, from 1 Peter. 1 Peter is a letter, a fairly brief one, written, it's hard to say when, I think kind of later. It claims authorship of Peter, but a typical practice in that period was to sort of attribute writings to certain figures who were authoritative. So by saying this is from Peter, that's not exactly, it's not meant to be deceptive. But it's meant to identify with the leadership of the church as found in the gospel. So, clearly whoever wrote this letter is aware of the history that has elevated the figure of Peter into leadership in the church, and so is borrowing that authority, essentially. And these letters are written for communities in Asia Minor, so southern Turkey, essentially, which I'm sure the actual Peter never visited in his life. I doubt very much he left Judea. But at any rate, here we have encouragement, sort of almost a cheerleading kind of tone, where the writer is trying to inspire these folks to think of themselves in a new way, to identify as God's special sort of possession, rather than allow themselves to become overwhelmed by what probably was a fair amount of hostility in their areas. This letter begins by addressing the exiles. Now, that's led to some speculation that perhaps these are people who had actually been forced out of, say, Rome or other parts of the empire, relocated or dislocated people. I doubt that that's actually the case. My suspicion is they are. He's talking about their spiritual exile, not so much their physical exile. I doubt that this is a diasporan community of Christians. I think what what we have is people who have formed these communities in these various areas, and in doing that have in effect exiled themselves from their societies, and understand their sort of position now to have changed, and are experiencing some of the difficulties of that, because that's a hard place to be, and it's hard to sustain that, especially when it's done in the assumption that it was all going to come to an end soon. You might be able to withstand that kind of hostility for, few months, maybe a year or so. But after a while, when you don't see any sort of indication that things are going to turn around, it gets kind of tough. It's hard to keep that sense of I guess distinctiveness, when there's so much pressure to just go back to what you were. And this is what the writer, I think, is recognizing and acknowledging, and helping them, trying to help them to sort of hang in there, and to give themselves a different, sense of purpose. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, God's own people. That's just such a powerful claim to make. And it on the one hand can set up sort of this victim sort of mentality. So we're just always under siege, and we see ourselves as sort of the the object of scorn, and there are a number of groups, in our own society that identify that way. Sometimes with justification, but sometimes often without any justification, really. And I don't want to go into, the current political situation, but if you look at the people who are, for instance, protesting the shutdown that we're experiencing right now, those folks, by and large, represent a particular ethnic base, and in they have it so far, it seems, represented um, a kind of a small portion of society. Um, so, that kind of victim mentality uh, is not unusual, and this kind of rhetoric can sort of feed that. On the other hand, it's this kind of rhetoric that provides folks with a sense of identity, and they needed that. This young group of Christians, they needed a new self-definition, um, and it is antagonistic in some ways, but it's also, I think, gives them sort of I guess, a sense of purpose, and uh, helps them to rely on one another more strongly. I notice, though, it's not just about self-definition, but it's also about ethical behavior, as it begins, rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. So, the writer is encouraging them to look at their own behavior and adjust that behavior so that it reflects this new way of living that they have adopted. So you're talking about intentionality and consistency. Long for the pure spiritual milk, like newborn infants, which is an interesting sort of a twist, because at one point in one of Paul's letters, he uses similar imagery as his way of saying, this is what I fed you. I fed you, as if you were infants in the faith. And he seems to indicate that that's for people just starting out, but as you mature, you become able to take more sort of substantial nourishment, and and Paul seems to make that sort of distinction between people who are new to the faith, who kind of need to be sort of coddled and treated gently with what with their whatever it is he's instructing them in. But then as you mature, you should be able to handle more nuanced ways of experiencing your faith and looking at the world. That it raises for me a dynamic that is very common, and it's not at all limited to the ancient world, where people have a tendency to kind of go through stages in their development. For the most part, we start out with a sort of non-critical approach, and in relation to Scripture, for instance, we might approach it literally and just sort of accept what's written as absolute and literal, and not question, any of what's being presented. And that's an early form of study, and everyone, kind of goes through that period. But then we move on, and as a person matures, then they become more able to think critically about the faith, and about the text, and that's kind of the stage where we begin to look more closely at, why would this writer have written this in this way? What's going on in that world at that time to uh, uh, sort of cause this kind of writing to be done. Um, so that's sort of the what we call critical historical method of looking at Scripture, trying to get behind the text to look more closely at the context, at the world in which it's being written. And a lot of people get to that stage, and that's kind of where they stop. And so they can be sort of very, they can be able to make those distinctions between what's metaphor and what's sort of literal. But I think the danger for that is that it all becomes sort of in your head. It's all, you're approaching it all sort of intellectually and not spiritually. And that's really the third stage in this process, which I think not as many make it to. The third stage is called post-critical. And so you have pre-critical, critical, and post-critical, where you're then able to take what you have learned about the Scripture and about its context, and then reintegrate it into your life, and discover how it can still shape you, and rather than keeping it, Scripture at arm's length and looking at it objectively, you can begin to sort of incorporate that into your own sort of understanding of the world. And I think the gospel lesson for this. So, well, let me finish up with First Peter, I guess. So First Peter this writer is trying to get these folks to a point where they're able to live their faith in opposition to a society that is hostile to them. And so trying to give them a stronger sense of their role in God's purposes in the world. A chosen race, a royal priesthood, this idea that they are more than their experiences, and so to look beyond what they are going through to a deeper meaning, and in that way to sustain their community and continue in their faith. And it's a challenge for any time, and a challenge certainly for us, as we often find ourselves in opposition to the society around us. So it's can be a source of I think of comfort and hope in the midst of circumstances that sometimes we find ourselves in, even in the modern world. But as far as the imagery, I think the gospel lesson provides more interesting sort of examples of imagery. Yeah, and this is from the Gospel of John, and it's a continuation from where we left off yesterday at the end of chapter 14. So this is the first 11 verses rather of chapter 15. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. That's a lovely passage and image, this idea of the vine and the branches. Jesus is the source of our hope, of our peace, of our life. And we draw on that source continually. And if we get cut off from it, we wither. Our spirits perish. Now, that doesn't mean we're, this image of, they're gathered up, thrown into the fire, and burned. That's not to say that you'll be condemned, for eternity or anything like that. I think the point of that metaphor is to indicate sort of the result of being sort of cut off from God. It leaves us bereft. It leaves us feeling at a loss, and as if we are simply being, consumed. It's powerful imagery, and I think it's helpful because we, I think, are always struggling to find, what is at the center of our lives, what is at the core, and where do we go to really experience communion with the divine. And what Jesus is saying here is, go to me. Find your life in me. And allow yourself to abide in that love. And it's always love, ultimately. You will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. If you keep my commandments, and earlier on in this discourse, as I mentioned yesterday, that's where Jesus has said, I give you a new commandment, to love one another as I have loved you. So that sense of sacrificial love on behalf of others, that's at the core of life for Jesus' followers. And they experience that when they identify with him, when they draw on Jesus' presence for their strength and for their peace. That, getting to that point and getting past, first of all, we know that obviously he's not saying literally, I'm a vine and you are branches. This is all metaphorical language. But learning how to sort of integrate that sense of unity and that dependence on Christ into our lives. That's the post-critical task. That's when when we begin to approach Scripture as a spiritual exercise and not purely intellectual. When we meditate on those images and allow that way of understanding our relationship to Christ to shape us. That's where we find sustenance. And that's what gives us the, I want to say fortitude, the strength to endure difficulties. Maybe even the uncertainty and loss that we're experiencing right now. If you've been watching the news, you know that there are so many people, especially in the healthcare field, but who are really struggling with what they are dealing with, and our own sort of connection to that, I think, is related to our understanding of how Jesus is present in our lives, because God is present in those circumstances, and the way we respond to them, I think, is a reflection of our connection to Christ. What I've tried to explain to folks about our being shut down at the church right now is this is not about our fear primarily. This is about compassion. We express our faith during this time by making sure we are not putting anyone at risk, because the church is made up of a lot of people who are very vulnerable, and we have a responsibility for them, and so we have to draw on our connection to Christ and to one another as branches of the same vine as we go through this period together. And we can do that. We can do that. We do it because we know that our experiences are not all that we are. Like the writer of Peter says, once we were no people, now we are God's people. Even though we're going through difficulty now, we are no less God's own possession in the world. And how we make our way through this together will, I think, be the measure of that identity. And so we do it with compassion, with hope, with a sense of purpose, and not with resentment or anger or all the other expressions that hostility that is being expressed so much right now. We do this as a way of expressing our compassion and our love for one another. So, I hope that's a helpful perspective on these passages. And I hope you'll take some time today to read them over, especially that passage from John's Gospel, John 15, 1 through 11. Find your life as part of the vine. Find your connection to God through Christ. Branches of the same vine, all drawing on the same source for your life and for your hope. I hope to see you again tomorrow, and I hope today is a good one for you, and you are safe and well and at peace. Until tomorrow.